Hi, we're going to look at conservative politics presented from James Q. Wilson. Um, James Q. Wilson was a theorist who died probably about 7 years ago, but really had an influence in the 70s. Um, he would have had experienced the 60s and the turmoil that came out of that, as far as people questioning the government, the Vietnam conflict, um, the second feminist movement getting started, the civil rights movement, and the rise of crime. Um, and during this time, there was a lot of commotion. Now, before we start, also, uh, for criminal justice as a department in college literally was not in existence when he writes this. Wilson was a political scientist himself, and he was looking at the turmoil around him. So, one of the things that when he writes this book, the original I think was 75 maybe, and then we have a 79 and an 83 version of it. The research that he's using in here was very spotty because there was very little research done. So that's kind of one of the things that when you're reading some of this research might seem like it supports or different or rejects, but we would look at a lot of that research as not being very valid today. So one of the things that Wilson really represents kind of conservative thought when we come to looking at crime. And one of the beliefs that he has is that predatory crimes or individual crimes that go on in the streets are more serious than white collar crimes, which is very interesting because I teach a white collar crime slash political slash corporate crime. And one of the interesting things is that white collar crime costs us more money than all the predatory crimes that happen. Frank Hagen did a study several years ago, and he compared all the burglaries and robberies that had occurred to the United States. And then he looked at some of the different white collar criminals, such as Keating, who was involved in the savings and loan scandal, and found out that only a few white collar criminals committed more crime that cost more to American citizens than all the burglaries and robberies added up. Yet, from a conservative standpoint, we're much more worried about the individual that's on the street, which really, one of the things that we do when we're talking about predatory crime is really looking at lower class for the most part. Second, it was a basic belief of Wilson and other conservatives that we really don't have to discover the causes of crime. He was a political scientist, so he weighed the costs and benefits. And he believed that you could have a problem, crime, and then think of effective policies that could reduce that crime. So where he saw criminologists and what would be termed liberals looking to discover the causes of crime, whether they be poverty or family dysfunction, he said that it really wasn't necessary to uncover those because we could come up with effective policies that could reduce the rate of crime. So another belief that he had and has been disproven over time, but remember he's writing this book, probably started on it in the early 70s, and there was no real research. He believed prisons are not schools for crime. There is no empirical evidence to support this. Now, today, there's a lot of empirical evidence to support this. And so the thought process, I think that why he was bringing this up as an issue was if your solution is to send people to prison to correct their behavior, you don't want to send them to a place that's going to make them worse. Today, we know that, you put a bunch of criminals in one place, they learn criminal behavior from one another. Another basic belief that he had was that the death penalty is ineffective if not administered swiftly. And so this is the belief that the system makes the death penalty not effective because it takes so long to execute somebody. So there are mandatory appeal processes that somebody that's given the death penalty has to go through. Again, we have vast amount of research that has looked at the death penalty in states where there is a death penalty and states where there isn't. And we have found today that there is no correlation between the death penalty and the reduction of crime. So the belief that if we killed the person swiftly, the only thing that it would really have an effect on is it might save money within the system. Or the only person that it would affect would be that individual themselves. But these are precursors for deterrence theory, which really looks forward. We're going to punish you so you don't do something again. In this case, the death penalty is to at least alert those that might be considering doing something that could get them the death penalty that they shouldn't do it because you're going to get the death penalty. In reality, criminals don't think that far in advance. Then they literally, unless it's a friend of theirs, really don't know what's going on. For example, we know that Texas has the most executions. So think to yourself, who's on death row and what did they do in Texas? Most of us would answer, I have no clue. 5 is gun control is about preventing those people who are at risk from using them. I love this statement because it makes it sound like it's so simple. So when we look at like mass shootings, a lot of these people have obtained their guns legally. So they're not stealing the guns from criminals. They're people who at one point displayed normal, legally required aspects to get the gun. And then they became risky based on why they wanted the gun. So we look at some of the shootings like the Vegas shooting. Here's a guy who had worked all his life, appeared to be pro-social, but apparently had some other things. He was considered an odd duck. And a lot of the research shows that mass shootings are done primarily by people who are pissed off about something. And they want the world to know that they've been a victim somehow. And even though we really haven't found out too much about the guy that did the Vegas shooting, he legally obtained all those weapons. Although, wouldn't someone wonder why somebody needed so much ammunition? So I think it's really quick to say, well, gun control is about getting those people at risk. Well, even if we limited gun control to only giving them to people that weren't at risk, what happens when those weren't at risk become risk? So, I mean, there's a lot of problems when we start talking about gun control. But conservatives really kind of make it, well, it isn't the gun, it's the people. Well, yeah, but they use the gun to kill other people. Wilson also pointed to the youth culture. And so, excuse me, remember that he is coming out of the 60s where we have a lot of issues that were different from the 50s. And the baby boomers really created after the Korean War and after World War II, kind of got those backwards, the largest teen population. So teens in themselves do unruly thing. And a lot of times teens early on had to work, help the family out, whether they had a farm or a job to help the family. But when we start looking at the 60s and 70s, there were so many teens, a lot of them weren't absorbed into this community, particularly if you were lower class. The other thing that happened in the 60s is that there were a lot of influences, and I don't think that youth specifically chose crime, addiction, and welfare. It may have seemed that way to Wilson because one, the population was introduced more to drugs, but a lot of it was because our communication systems were much better than they were in the 50s and 40s. So think about the influence of radio and television and the ability to hear about these issues. And so if somebody was thinking about trying drugs, then they heard about drugs through the media. The other thing is, as the opportunities for employment rose within the 60s, because we were very progressive and the economy was doing well, a lot of people were left out of that. And so those that were on welfare, it seemed that the numbers went up. But remember, the population went up too. And so it may have seemed like, well, gee, in the 50s, a lot of these kids chose to be pro-social. And now in the 60s, they're choosing crime, addiction, and welfare. When in reality, the whole society was changing. Finally, I have this. The media promoted and celebrated this culture. I mean, constantly think about what the media promotes. They're in it for the money. They want the stories that are going to grab attention. They don't carry like the guy that shoplifted. They carry the guy that murdered. And when we're talking about the 60s, a lot of the things that were on TV were about protests at colleges, protests in the community, like the Democratic Convention in 1968, about hippies, about drug use, about the world collapsing because these youth gone wild. And it was the first time that people questioned the government's motives, particularly when it came to the Vietnam conflict. So another thing then that Wilson saw as the cause of crime was the breakdown of the community. And because population was moving around a little more and you had an influx of more people, he believed that there was a failure of the community to establish one set of standards. And we look at this today, and yes, there is this problem that ultimately, when you don't have a strong value system, even though you have a large society of different backgrounds, you should have a set of standards that people go by. And we see today that if we went and asked Americans just in a survey, name the top 3 values of Americans, I think we would get a lot of different answers. One would be something to do with money. And we're going to talk about that later. Okay, 2, he saw the community being ripped apart by centralization, where local government has lost a little control over the community, and says that this breaks down the formal as well as informal. Well, you look at some of the structures that we have, and let's say we're looking at Big Rapids, which is a small community. One of the things that they rely on the state, which would be more centralization, is for funding. And so it may have been economically wise to put certain activities under that state, even though the culture of the community might be one thing, versus the culture in, let's say, Grand Rapids, because it's a different, it's a bigger city. So you go from rural to urban. But Wilson believed that this was really part of the breakdown. He said that there were problems of prejudice, and it could be not, and this is, people are very wary of people that aren't like them, whether now he's saying color, ethnicity, or behavior. But sometimes it takes, to meet somebody face to face to find out what they're like. People are fearful of the unknown. And then you take the media and how it then ultimately pushes some of those prejudices in the way it reports. One of the things he talks about class prejudice, and he says people perceive that race prejudice is available, but he's saying it's more based on class prejudice. And that at the time when he's writing this, that there were dominant middle class values that ultimately didn't meet up with the lower class values. And so even though the middle class primarily was white and the lower class was primarily African Americans and maybe Hispanics, he kind of writes it off that it's really class prejudice. And then he said that one of the problems is that people within the community have no stake in conformity with the group. And so he says that, there might be affluent whites, they don't have children, so they're not going to get invested in like community activities for kids. There are elderly, poor whites that oftentimes don't get involved. They might be fearful. They might stick to themselves. I have a neighbor that the only time I see her is when the mail comes. And once in a while, late at night at Meijer, I never see her come out of her house during the day. She just kind of stays in. She's friendly enough if I approach her, but she waves, but she really doesn't participate in any activities. He said, see blacks who experience segregation and are pushed into close proximity. And we look at certain neighborhoods, particularly in Chicago, that when you push a bunch of people together and then you don't supply anything else that makes them more pro-social, then it's kind of a dog-eat-dog world. And you think of some of these neighborhoods where the schools are filled with violence. There's no employment opportunities within the neighborhood. The only thing that the employment is pro-criminal behavior. So Wilson concludes, due to the breakdown within the family, because the family's not taking care of their youth and teaching them pro-social behavior, and the community is also not teaching pro-social behavior, that there really is no moral development that can counter the influence of what's going on. And at the time, he referred to it as the drug influence. And he said individual ideologies that may be hindered by one's environment or impulsive nature is really the cause of why crime it was going up. It was the breakdown of his traditional family roots and the traditional community. And you will hear this with Warner Warner and Birchfield talk about misperceived attitudes. King and Maruna talk about attitudes and who has the attitudes, where you want to go back to the good old days. And so what Wilson at the time says doesn't cause crime, poverty. Well, we now show the link to that poverty is correlated to crime. Bad schools, we find, if you're not educated, that limits employment, that limits opportunities, and so it can be related to crime as well. Unemployment If you look historically at unemployment, a person becomes unemployed. They might try for a while to get a job. If they're not successful, they get disgusted, they give up, and then they don't want to work. And it's hard to go back into the workforce when you've been unemployed for a while. So ultimately, when you're unemployed for long periods of time, it can become generational. And then when you have welfare that can try to bumper those effects, it makes people less likely to enter in because the welfare system is not based on incentives. It's based on punishments. And we'll talk about that later. The other thing is that he said what doesn't cause crime is rundown housing. Well, it might cause crime in a different way. Think about Flint, lead pipes, poisoning. Think about mercury in the water, lead in paint. Well, rundown housing usually means it's old. And so now we have all these connections to brain damage that limits IQ for children that grow up in these environments. So if you have a lower IQ, that's going to affect your education, that might affect employment. And ultimately, if you can't get a good education and you can't get employed, then you're probably going to be poor. So he does talk about the Great Society, which was something that President Kennedy in the 60s tried to push. And the Great Society idea was that we had this large middle class at the time. And so the big thing that the Kennedys wanted to do was make it available so that the lower class could move up into middle class. Now, if you were a conservative, you don't like all those programs that are trying to help people. And yes, crime went up, but the population went up at the same time. So some of the Great Society programs might have been inner city job training so that people could get jobs, they could learn trades. And there was a lot of success with that. But when you're looking for reasons to blame policies and crime, the Great Society was a great way to blame that the conservative agenda was being dismissed and might stop the crime. And so he even points out, well, here, the economy's doing well, but welfare increases. So some of his policy recommendations that crime is rewarding. Why would people do crime? And thus, we need to deter it. And we must make the risks of doing the crime outweigh the rewards. And you're going to study this coming up, and this is deterrence. The government, and so one, we've got to deter. Well, we want the risk, which would be punishment, to outweigh the crimes and whatever benefit they get from them. So obviously, Wilson wanted the government to enhance the criminal justice system, which when I first started in the system, you always voted for conservatives because they were always putting more money into the criminal justice system. I wouldn't say the same thing today, though. So one of the things Wilson wanted, he wanted more police. He talked about community policing where the police got to know the neighborhood so that would increase, that people would tell them what crime was going on. So that would increase the certainty that people would get caught. He wanted to increase the courts. If you were a high rate offender, let's make a high bail and get you through the court system. He wanted to eliminate indeterminate sentences, which were a minimum and a maximum. And a lot of times those minimums were adjusted based on participating in programs or good time or institutional behavior. At the time when they're talking, when I was working in the system, if you had no misconducts while institutionalized, you could get out at 3/4 of your minimum. So you got so many days credit for every days off your sentence for every day that you behaved, which was really, when you look at it, incentive based. What Wilson and conservatives liked was determinant, that there was a set sentence for crimes to eliminate leniency of judges, but also so that if you did the crime, you got the same time. Well, this then goes against what he really believed about the breakdown of communities and a set of standards. If I steal something in a community, like let's say up in the UP, let's say I steal a snowmobile, it's going to be seen as a lot more serious than if I steal a snowmobile in Detroit, where there's a lot of crime. And so the sentences might be different based on the community. So one of the questions that you can kind of ponder is, when we do talk about community standards, shouldn't those standards be reflected in the community criminal justice system? Finally, Wilson wanted to enhance prisons. He wanted more small prisons, which, was something that we wanted in 1870 at the Prison Congress, but we still really haven't built small prisons. He wanted to hire more officers so they could stop contraband, but he believed that minor offenses or first-time offenders should go to community corrections. But if they fail, then they can get incarcerated. Neighborhoods, that we would use foot patrols to get to know the residents. And this is really interesting. He also suggested hiring private security in high predatory crime areas. It's funny, today there are communities that have their own police departments, because when you cut taxes, you don't have money to spend. And so there's been, particularly in California, there's been like communities that hire their own police department because the county sheriff's department can't cover the territory because they don't have enough officers. Another thing that he advocated was forming self-help groups, which this would be like neighborhood watch. Guardian angels were big back in the 70s. These were people that wore red berets, and they watched the subways to make sure no one got hurt. Now, today we have varying conservative viewpoints. Most of them revolve around where they see human nature, and human nature is, if not watched, would be predatory in nature. And I think in Wilson's book, he refers to that he sees the world from a Hobbesian philosophical point, where basically the fittest survive. So individual defects in human nature or in intelligence as the master predictor of criminal involvement. So he then is basically, some people say, well, it's the person. And so there's been books written, whether it be about race, class, culture, that these are the things that cause crime. Two, they see individuals as logical actors choosing crime. This is kind of the whole idea of deterrence, that people are rational, they make the choice to do wrong. So we just have to think of a punishment that's higher than what they get. And so that was one of Wilson's beliefs. Another very conservative viewpoint is offenders persist in crime because they think differently rather than logically. I agree with this. When we start talking about thinking errors and pro-criminal thought process, it is different from pro-social. One of the things I remember Dr. Frank Collins saying is that liberals won't admit that criminals think differently, and conservatives won't admit that sometimes they think logically. So it's kind of funny that this is one of them. But this goes into one of the reasons people stay in crime is they're different from us. So when you separate out the other, then you can do different things to them. One of the ones that you hear a lot is it's our permissive culture or moral poverty, which was kind of weaved into Wilson's belief system. People aren't following God, that that abortion is a moral sin, that giving up on the death penalty, and women not staying at home and taking care of their man. We've basically abandoned traditional roles, and they see this as moral poverty. 5, they claim that public disorganization or incivility leads to crime because the police and criminal justice system tolerate it. Well, the system can't get every person that swears and lock them up, because then everybody probably would be locked up. But there is something about disorganization in a culture and incivility. And I think today we see this in the media with the back and forth of politicians, that today we really can't even discern what is the truth, because both sides spin it to their liking to try and make the other side the enemy. And so this incivility, if you've got the leaders on TV doing it, it trickles down through society. And so I always like to look like at Facebook, and someone will post something, really something that they're just talking about, or they might ask a question. And then you look at what the responses are. A lot of people just answer the question. But then there's those people, well, how stupid are you? You should look it up yourself. Why are you wasting time? There's always that incivility. It used to be if you didn't have anything nice to say, you just kept it to yourself. The last one, which we have seen rise recently, is this nationalist perspective. And they ultimately try to make one group really their rules to be what everybody should do. And sometimes I have acquiesced to minorities rather than the middle class. A nationalist perspective would see minorities creating a problem based on their own perspective, let's say they're working class, but it could be reverse. And so this is a rather new one that is listed, and we'll just have to see how it turns out. And that is a little lecture on conservative politics.